required enlargement of our cortex. And the fundamental requirement that, unlike other species where the offspring run off into the jungle or swim away immediately, the nature of those components of our humanity, if you will, or what defines our species, required fundamentally that our offspring are cared for well over a decade in regard to learning from us or mirroring our behaviors. And the cost of that in terms of the mother, as an example, is extraordinary in terms of energy, resources, time. And as a result, we evolved a system which effectively is hardwired within us to respond to the suffering, if you will, or the pain of our offspring, because if they're not attended to, they die. And the reward for caring, for responding, for nurturing, actually is given to us in the release of certain types of hormones, one which I'm sure you've heard of, oxytocin, or the nurturing or love hormone. And when that is released, we have a pleasurable sensation because it stimulates our reward centers. So when we see one of our offspring, we have a desire to intervene and to care. As we evolve from the nuclear family to the hunter-gatherer tribe, which, remember, until 6 to 8,000 years ago was our primary survival strategy in groups of 10 to 50, the same situation occurred in that if a member of your group or tribe was suffering or in pain, you had these incredible abilities in regard to interpreting microfacial expressions, body language, even smells, to see that they're suffering. And their suffering actually would interfere with their ability to respond to threat towards the tribe, because everybody had a role. And as a result, you had a motivational desire to alleviate that suffering so they could be their best and be part of the community and protect the community. And those are wonderful attributes. And even today, I would suggest to you that if you have a loved one or someone you care about, they can walk into a room and they don't have to say a word, and you have a sense of how they feel and maybe something's going on with them. And we still carry that deeply within us today. The problem with our evolution as a species, in part, is this continued sense of tribalism, where one wants to identify with people who are like them, look like them, act like them, think like them, basically to create an echo chamber because it makes us feel safe and secure. Of course, the problem in global society is that there's such a diversity of opinions that unless you go out of your way to understand other people's opinions, you may have a tendency to be biased against them or not want to engage them because you feel threatened or you don't feel comfortable. And this is where the other part of our evolution that still is with us impedes our ability to be present and to connect with others. And this brings us up to neuroanatomy, where we know that there is a connection between our brain, our heart, and other organs in our body. It's not a one-way street from the brain to those organs. It's, in fact, a two-way street. And particularly with regard to the heart, there is an immense neural representation. And this is why people often say, my heart tells me this, or I'm feeling this from my heart, or these feelings towards another relate to your heart. And while these are ancient words, if you will, or terms, science has now borne out the reality that this brain-heart connection is quite profound. And it is mediated through something called the vagus nerve, which is the wondering nerve. and goes to essentially all organs of the body, but particularly is represented in the heart, and represents our autonomic nervous system. This part of our nervous system actually that functions independent of us on a conscious level. Now, the good thing about that is that it does that. The bad thing about it is that it does that. And the reason I say that is that what people don't appreciate is that we have a sympathetic nervous system, which many would be familiar with because it's often called the flight, fight, or freeze response. And this is associated with threat. And the other is the parasympathetic nervous system, which often is called the rest and digest system. Why is this important? Well, remember, our DNA has not changed for the last 200,000 years. So fundamentally, we are the exact same people as was on the savannah in Africa. Yet, of course, as we all know, modernity or technology has dramatically affected our environment. And as a result, for many people in this day and age, we have chronic stimulation of our threat response. And in fact, it can even be manipulated by people who, through different types of narratives, create threat. And what happens when, even at a low level, your sympathetic system is engaged, you have the release of hormones and proteins that are very, very deleterious to your health. Certainly on the savannah in Africa, if you saw the grass move and you knew from patterns previously that could represent a lion, then it's wonderful that your sympathetic nervous system engaged because your heart rate increases through the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine, your pupils dilate, blood is diverted from your gastrointestinal tract, your digestive tract, your skeletal muscles, and allows you to run off and jump in a tree. And if you survive, that's great. If you don't, it probably doesn't matter. But if you do survive, these hormones go down to this baseline level, and you're back to sort of engagement of your parasympathetic nervous system. The problem is that we have an epidemic because of modernity and technology of stress, anxiety, and depression in the West. And that is, of course, a manifestation of the chronic stimulation of this fear response, which not only impedes your ability to process and be discerning, but actually has a very, very deleterious effect on one's health. But the great news is that over the last 30 years, neuroscientists, psychologists, and others have learned actually what has been known for thousands of years through Eastern types of beliefs or religions, the power of our mind to affect our vagus nerve and also to interpret what our organs, if you will, are telling us. And this is what's really exciting and has the ability to impact and is impacting millions of people, especially in the West, to not only alleviate their suffering, but also to improve their health and actually understand the power of compassion and the joy of being alive.
Jim, that's great. Thank you. Wow, I'm taking that all in. I was actually taking notes myself. I want to open it up for questions, but before that, I have one other question for you, which is, how do you take care of yourself? Tell us a little bit about your practice. I think that you've, for whatever reason, you've chosen probably one of the most stressful careers, one that, at least when I think of the life of a neurosurgeon, and reading about some of the operations that you've performed and what your day-to-day life must be like in terms of the clinical part of your life, coming in contact with life and death, and having to make fast and difficult decisions. What do you do just if you can tell us a couple words, how do you take care of yourself? What's your practice like?
Well, it's maybe has multiple facets. You're right. I mean, neurosurgery can be extraordinarily stressful, not only from the fundamental nature of holding someone's life in your hand, if you will, but all that surrounds that in terms of interacting with family members or the individual who's dying. Uh, uh, but what some people unfortunately choose to do in those situations or these very stressful environments is uh, they have a tendency to react because they're afraid, or they turn off their humanity, feeling that being a pure technician is what's necessary for them to do their jobs, to hold someone's life in their hand. Because if you think about their humanity, and I gave some examples actually in my book, it's an extraordinary responsibility. The challenge, though, is when you objectify that person to do the operation, if you will, you turn off your emotions. How do you turn them back on and carry appropriate emotions when you're interacting with a family member or others? And some people do not have that capacity, which is extraordinarily unfortunate. You know, and I'm sure probably some of you have seen me talk. I mean, I get emotional, and in fact, I get tearful, and sometimes I even cry. And what's interesting is many times people say, wow, it must have been really hard for you to get up there and be in front of those people and show your emotions. And the fact of the matter is that it isn't, because I don't mind showing that I'm vulnerable or that I'm in pain. And the thing is, that is what allows us to connect with people. But there's a time and a place for that. And so the other aspect is that when events happen, whether it's in the operating room, where it's particularly important, but life in general, one of the things that has taken me time to, and I won't say master, but attempt to master, is the ability to pause and have an appropriate response. And of course, Viktor Frankl, as I'm sure you've read, talks about stimulus and response and the pause in between. And that's where our freedom lies, and that's where actually so many things can occur or not. And when you recognize this, you realize the gift you've been given, because it is a gift of choice. And so when an event occurs, let's say in the operating room, my heart rate doesn't increase. I'm talking about a negative event. I have the ability to not have a reaction to that. And as a result, when you don't have that sudden reaction which stimulates your threat response, it actually allows your parasympathetic nervous system to continue to be engaged. And then your frontal executive control areas are there for you, and it allows for a more discerning, thoughtful response, and allows for a more creative response. And this is what I have spent a great deal of time working on. And in fact, this is the work that I do, because it takes you from this fear-based pattern of reaction to one of a thoughtful, discerning pattern. Now, when you ask me about my own practice, as you know from the book and talks I've given, as a child, I used to meditate for hours at a time. And while that's wonderful, as we know from the work of a variety of individuals, and I'm thinking of also Thich Nhat Hanh at the time, or at this time, you don't have to sit for hours with your legs crossed meditating to meditate. And I think as you have experienced, and many have, life becomes a meditation, in the sense that you can walk and meditate and be mindful and thoughtful And actually, what I do at my own home when I come home after, in fact, almost every day, I have actually a backyard which has a hardscape, and there are these concrete blocks that are separated by loose stones. And having children and a dog, those loose stones are invariably all over the place when I get home. And so what I actually do is walk around for 5 or 10 minutes just with my feet, putting the stones back. It's a completely meaningless task, but allows me to relax, be mindful, be thoughtful, and calm myself down from the rest of the day. But the other thing I do every morning, and I talk about something called the alphabet of the heart in my book, is to actually reflect back on that. And for our listeners who may not have read my book, and I'm not trying to sell this, but if you buy it, I'm happy. In my book, I talk about a lecture that I gave to incoming medical students to hopefully inspire them and give them a tool, if you will, a simple tool, to center them as physicians and probably more importantly as human beings. And it was based on great reflection of my own life and trajectory of my life and those central tenets that have allowed me to be who I am. And that's not to say perfect by any measure, but for me to be able to reflect. And it came down to 10 letters of the alphabet. And those letters are C through L. And that is my practice. I sit by my bed when I wake up and with intention, not only, first of all, be appreciative of simply being able to be there, but then also go through this alphabet. And it starts with C, compassion for self and others. D, recognizing the dignity of every person, that I'm not lesser or better than any other individual, and every individual has the right to be respected and have dignity. E is for equanimity, because of course this evenness of temperament, and in some ways I was reflecting on that earlier, is critically important. Also, it's wonderful to have people give you accolades and have positive events occur, which you, of course, love because you're being recognized. But those types of things are very, very transitory. And I suggest that the down parts of our lives, those which we hope to avoid, are actually, though, the ones that, for many of us, give us the greatest lessons, insights, and wisdom that allow us to carry on in this world and see the world and the true nature of reality. But not getting lost in either of them or having an attachment to either of them, especially the highs, and having this evenness of temperament allows you to go throughout the world in a much better mental state. F is for forgiveness. And am I taking too much time?
I want to suggest it. No, I just wanted to take a pause there. And I was noting that we're now on F, and I want to come back to F. But before we do that, I just want to see, I'm just imagining that people have questions and things that they're wondering about, that they want to ask you or me or Regina. And then I've noted, we will come back to F. I'm like, what does that stand? No, I know already, but we'll get there. Are there any questions for that you have for Jim or for me, or anything that's on people's minds? And I want to just state there's no such thing as a dumb question. Like anything that you're wondering, probably everyone's wondering.
And in order to, if you'd like to raise your hand, and then we'll call on you and unmute you. Dr.
Jim, do you have a question?
But if you go to your chat box, there's a raise hand function. But I do, while you're all contemplating the question you might have, we do have a few questions from people who are unable to attend this live event, and they'll be listening to the recording later. So I'm going to read a couple of those questions right now for you, Dr. Doty. So this one, was compassion and or altruism observed in animals, or are these inherently human?
No, actually. In fact, mammals have a huge capacity to be compassionate. If we look at, and I hate to use the word higher mammals, because based on some of our behaviors as humans, I'm doubtful how that hierarchy works. But if you look at elephants, if you look at dolphins and other species, they have a capacity for carrying a memory and actually to love and to care for another. In fact, there are instances in the animal world, even beyond their species, to reach out and help another animal to survive. So no, I think that capacity is developed in the animal world and even in the insect world, where insects will work together for the greater benefit. So I think living organisms, and perhaps not as human society, will certainly have this capacity. And in fact, as humans, we can actually learn.
Thank you.
I'm reading the I'm just reading the chat box, and someone says, I'm loving the letters. Can we keep going with the letters? We'll come back to the letters. I'm sorry if I've disappointed those who were really.
We'll leave you in suspense.
I failed again. I just one mistake after another is the life of a Zen teacher.
This is a wonderful thing because you're allowing me to demonstrate compassion.
And forgiveness.
I need it. Thank you.
So I'll read a couple of the, a few people did chat in their questions. And so this one from Lee Lessman. How does meditation affect the emotional feelings via the brain changes?
Oh, that's a good question. That's about a 2-hour lecture. But we know that meditation can actually even change the thickness of certain parts of the brain, or even decrease the thickness in those areas associated with the fear response. It can actually diminish the size, actually. And the important thing, though, is one meditation is not necessarily like another. Two is we have immense capacity to change our brains and, in fact, change our physiology. And that can be actually for good or bad, because the nature of chronic stress changes your brain and it changes your physiology, right? And in fact, the military has actually used some techniques we know in regard to changing your brain actually in a very negative sort of way. And chronic exposure to negativity that is over and over reinforced can also have a very deleterious effect on your physiology. But the wonderful thing is that and I'm not sure if correctly is the right way, but I would simply suggest that there are techniques that allow you, if you will, to be your best self. And, I give a lecture, which is, I call Be the Author of Your Own Story. And really fundamentally, it is this capacity that we sometimes forget, because unfortunately what happens is, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, is that we listen to criticism, and this goes back to what Mark said about negativity. It has a tendency to stick to us. And then we create a narrative that we replay to ourselves oftentimes that is hypercritical, is unkind. And the problem is we often take that narrative to be us. And in fact, it's not us at all. But if you were to say to yourself, I'm not good enough, or I'm not worthy, or I don't deserve, or I can't, by definition, that becomes a reality. And the amazing thing is that these types of practices, meditation, etc., give us the capacity to change that narrative to one of self-affirmation, positivity. And when you do that, you are able to unlock your potential. And fundamentally, what Ruth did in the magic shop was make me, or allow me, to recognize this reality and change the narrative, which allowed me then to understand that I had created a prison for myself, and she gave me the key to unlock the door.
That's lovely.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we take a couple more, Mark, from the audience?
Let's do another question or two, and then we'll leave everyone hanging about what F stands for. I like the tension.
Well, it started with forgiveness.
David Alley had a nice question, and I actually saw in the chat that the raise hand function is not visible, and so I will need to troubleshoot that, and so I apologize. So, okay, chat your questions, but I would like to call on David Alley to unmute himself and ask his question, or I can unmute you if you'd like. I've unmuted you, David.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't know whether volume is okay. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can hear you well. Thanks, David.
Thank you. Well, I'm thinking about a reference in one of the Search Inside Yourself books. I think Chad Ming Tan talks about basal ganglia, and I'm very much a layman, but it seems that that's a place that somehow body wisdom gets stored, and yet that's very loosely connected with verbal processing. And I'm feeling that perhaps there is great potential for us as we increase our mindfulness, as we hopefully teach and work with others around intuition, around greater appreciation of those kinds of heartfelt or gut feelings. And I would appreciate any thoughts about how we can cultivate that. I don't know whether there's a literal way of cultivating neurologically what happens in basal ganglia, but I appreciate your thoughts about intuition and how we can cultivate the heart, those kinds of gut instincts.
Sure. Yeah, I have to say, you look like the most interesting man in the world. Has anybody... and you are probably. But getting back to your question, yes, just to make a comment, it's interesting, isn't it, that many people from what's described as the third world want to come to the West with this false notion that conspicuous consumption somehow will lead to a better life. And yet, if we look back at those areas from which they come from, they actually have the greatest wisdom traditions and give us the greatest insights into the true nature of reality and the true nature of ourselves. And the reason I bring that up is because, to answer your question, these individuals who over centuries learned that they can in fact cultivate compassion and intuitively understand the power of that, it's now being affirmed by neuroscience. And yes, you can. And you mentioned the basal ganglia, but the thalamus, and as well as the caudate, and these other areas of the brain that are intimately involved in, if you will, a discerning, thoughtful, compassionate response. Through intention and repetition, we can create and strengthen neural pathways. And the practices that Search Inside Yourself and others, such as compassion cultivation training, have been demonstrated to be extraordinarily powerful in giving individuals a toolbox to address these issues, to alleviate their own suffering, and to also understand through compassion to themselves and through compassion to others, where they realize that the other is themselves, then that gives you the gift of connection. It gives you the gift of understanding that, in fact, we are all one. And when you're able to reach out then to others who may not think like you, look like you, and actually embrace them and care for them, as I tell in the book from my own experience, when I changed how I reacted to the world changed how it reacted to me.
Mm, mm.
Great.
Thank you. Do you want to do one more, Mark, or continue?
I have an idea.
Yes.
Jim, if you're willing to go along with this,
Sure.
What about, can you just kind of briefly bring us, how about F through I, and then we'll pause at I. And I'm trying to manage time here. We just have about 20 more minutes. So if you can maybe just take a couple of minutes, take us through I, and then we'll take a pause, ask a couple questions, and then we'll wrap up with the rest of the alphabet. How about that?
Mark, there's no I in team.
It's an excellent point. I'm glad, we're talking about reality and yes.
There's a me in team, if you. But anyway, so F, and this is forgiveness. And what happens to many of us is that oftentimes we perceive that others have slighted us or have been mean to us, etc., and we carry this grudge. And the problem is that when you carry grudges like that, it impedes actually your ability to go forward emotionally, especially in regard to that other person. And as people have said, somehow carrying anger towards another is simply you drinking poison and somehow thinking it will magically affect the other person. The only person it affects is you. So learning the ability to forgive and not carry grudges is very, very important. G is having gratitude. The nature of us humans is oftentimes, instead of appreciating how fortunate we are and blessed we are with our situation, and remember, if you're on this podcast, you were probably better off than 90% of people in the world. Remember that almost 50% of the world lives on less than $2.50 per day. So we are incredibly blessed to have food, shelter, security. But so often there's a tendency to look not at how others are who, let's say, may not have our advantages, to look up and wish we were like other people or had a bigger house or a better car, etc. And that, again, separates you from being present and gets you lost because of attachment. H is humility, and this is probably the hardest one for a neurosurgeon because we have big egos oftentimes. But as I said earlier, if an event occurs in the operating room, the first person I point a finger at is me. Until proven otherwise, it's my fault. And when you look at events that way, where you look initially within yourself, it frankly will modulate how angry you get. And the reality is that oftentimes when events occur, we have a tendency to blame others. And understanding that in life situations, you are no more important than another person. And in fact, I tell my residents, when you walk through the hospital, you can tell who's a good doctor. It's the person who engages everyone as an equal, whether that person is cleaning bedpans or taking out the trash. they are fundamentally just as important as you in regard to your existence on this earth. I is having integrity and values that you live by, a set of principles that you do not deviate from, that give you boundaries as far as your behavior, and you try to live with them. And then we're stopping there.
I was on the fence. You're on such a roll, but I want to. I see. We'll come back. I see a couple of questions that I think could be combined. These are questions for you. One from Susan, and then one from Noel. As it says, Susan says, as a physician, I'm sometimes challenged by the feeling that Western medicine seems to be dedicated to denying the first noble truth, right, the truth of suffering, and enabling patients to maintain this delusion, while at the same time I'm committed to compassion and ending suffering where I see it. How do you balance this understanding in your own practice? And it's kind of I think at the same time, I'm going to, Noel's question says, would love to ask a question about the power of emotion. So I think those two questions have a lot of overlap there, but Jim, you want to, what are your thoughts there?
Well, I tell people that unfortunately in the West, we have a healthcare system focused on illness, not focused on wellness. And that's the fundamental problem. Fortunately, there is a change occurring where people recognize the mind-body-spirit connection and how powerful that is in regard to health. They're recognizing how nutrition is important, how exercise is important, how, if you will, right thinking is important in regard to dealing with negative emotions. And getting to your question, emotions can have a profoundly negative effect and a profoundly positive effect. When you think negativity, how do you pronounce that? Negatively. What happens is that it triggers your threat response, because the very nature of negative emotions are a reaction to something that threatens you or you feel fearful about. And that has a horrible cascade in terms of blunting your immune system, releasing stress hormones, affecting cardiac function, affecting blood pressure, affecting the release of inflammatory proteins. And so positive thoughts actually do the opposite. So emotions can be very powerful. And oftentimes when events occur towards people, they have a emotional response to them. And what you realize, though, is that events in and of themselves have no good or bad. They're simply events. And it is us who choose to say whether they're negative or positive. And when you can actually look at them as simply events and not have that type of response, it actually can have a huge, huge effect on your health. As an example, in my own situation as a child, I used to have immense despair, anger, hopelessness about my personal situation because I had no control over it. And I used to expend all of this energy and negative energy, frankly, about that, and it affected me. And it affected how others responded to me. And when I suddenly appreciated that they were simply events, it wasn't as if there was some person saying, let's do this evil thing to Jim. They were simply events. And in fact, my parents, I used to carry a lot of anger towards. And when I recognized actually that they were deserving of compassion because they had their own suffering, and their suffering, unfortunately, clouded their ability to engage appropriately or the manner in which I wanted them to respond. And when I understood that they were dealing with their own issues and did not have the resources or tool set to deal with that, it dissipated my own anger. And I simply accepted them for who they were and still loved them. And this is a gift and this is a challenge for each of us.
Let's come back to Jay. Why don't you?
Well, as you can see, in many ways, these are all interrelated. And Jay is for justice, but it's really in the context of us recognizing how fortunate we are, and also recognizing that others are suffering. And as a result, we have a responsibility for our place in the world to care for those who are vulnerable, are suffering. So it's our responsibility to seek justice for them, to be there for them. And then K is kindness. As you know, compassion is the recognition of another suffering with this motivational desire to alleviate that suffering, but it does not necessarily mean that you are able to. But kindness neither needs suffering to occur. Kindness simply being the demonstration of a positive act towards another with no motivational desire for anything else. Simply, you are caring for another human being. And of course, when you look at the totality of this alphabet, and brings us to the end of 10 letters or the alphabet of the heart, that's love, and that contains everything.
Great. Well, I'm relieved that we actually made it through the entire alphabet of the heart. But those are terrific practices, and I appreciated, Jim, how that was your answer to when I asked you about your own practice that you practice with these. It sounds like they're embodied in your daily activity. Just terrific.
Can I tell you a story real quick?
Please. You can take your time.
We'll just go on all day. Well, what's extraordinary about that story, that alphabet, if you will, for me, is that about 2 months after I gave that lecture, a woman reached out to me and sent me an email, and she said, you know, that I'm a person of faith. I'm the spiritual director of the largest homeless shelter in the United States, and I was overwhelmed at my job, and in fact, I had resigned. My friends had sent me scripture. Nothing was powerful enough to bring me back, if you will, or want to return to work. And on my last day at work, someone shared that talk with you, and it gave me the strength to return to work. And that was just profound, and actually, I cried. And I acknowledged that to her, and a few months later, she said, you know, we began that practice of yours with our clients at the homeless shelter, and it's proved very powerful. And then she sent me another email later, and she said, you know, I shared that with a friend, and she has a 9-year-old daughter who makes beads. And on her own, this young lady actually made a set of beads. And she said, you know, prayer beads, malas are present in every religion. And this little girl made a set of 10 wooden beads, but on her own, she added a 10th bead to represent the golden rule. Would you mind if we sold these as a fundraiser for the homeless shelter? And they also have a peace center. And I said, absolutely, of course. And then a little while later, she sent me a video she had made, which is on YouTube and under Compassion Beat. This is in San Antonio. And it was this beautiful video showing this young lady with her hands on a golden cloth and laying out a string and stringing these beads. And this woman talking about, again, prayer beads, malas, the power of them to set one's intention and to activate that intention through repetition, which, as we know from neuroscience, actually creates and strengthens neural pathways. And so, in fact, what I do now is I actually have sets of those beads, and that is my practice. So I sit with those beads and go through each letter with intention every morning, and then evoke the golden rule. And I carry that set of beads in my pocket. And throughout the day, I pause because I stick my hands in my pocket periodically. And I feel those beads. And then I just pick a letter arbitrarily and sit with that for 10 to 15 seconds with my eyes closed. And it resets my intention.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that story. I'm also just kind of taking in all the people who are here on this webinar and recognizing that, you know, I don't know if you know this, Jim, but I'm actually going to get to hang out with these people. I think next week is the beginning of Engage in San Francisco. and we're going to get to
I
spend
thought
we're
you
going
were
to get to spend
gonna-
five we're going to get to spend 5 days together.
Oh,
We might have to somehow have you come by, if I don't know if that's in the realm, but I'm looking forward to meeting these people.
anything is possible. I was hoping you were going to mention the name of a bar in San Francisco.
Did you have one in mind?
Well, I have a whole list here. If you want.
Well, I do want to report.
Hold
I have
on.
a big shout out. You sold one book has been sold. Someone said I just ordered Dr. Doty's book, so it's a success, Jim. We sold a book. Really glad.
That'll buy me a drink tonight.
Let's see. We may not be able to get to all these questions, but this is a great one that I think is again, it could be a 2-hour lecture, but this is a question. Oops, where'd it go? Oh, yeah, this is from Chip Grossman. How does one cultivate compassion in meditation? And how does compassion meditation differ from mindfulness meditation from a neurological perspective?
Now I'm going to have to evoke my friend John Kabat-Zinn here. But so I divide compassion cultivation or compassion meditation into 4 parts. And typical mindfulness meditation, of course, has, if you will, survey or relaxing the body, if you will, and being able to attend and focus, followed by being able to have a non-judgmental response to thoughts that are flowing through your head as you're involved in this meditation. And it's really quite wonderful in that way because it mitigates that negative emotional response to negative thoughts. But that being said, and I've actually had conversations with John about this, he will acknowledge that while implicitly compassion is part of mindfulness, it's not explicit. And I would suggest to you, and I think that is somebody on a night somewhere here?
Yeah, somehow the sound has gotten funky here.
But I would say that you can actually have individuals who may be a type A or a narcissistic personality type who actually use these mindfulness type of practice to become a more ruthless, let's say, stock trader or business person. And in fact, somebody used an example, you can have a mindful sniper, right? And that's really not what we're striving for here. So I would say that when you have a more explicit component of the compassionate nature of a practice, that's more powerful, and I believe science is supporting this. And if you look at the work of Kristen Neff, she adds the 3rd component, which is self-compassion. So it, in some ways, aligns with my book in the sense of you recognize these negative thoughts, you don't have an emotional response to them, but self-compassion gives you ability to change the narrative or change the channel from one of negativity to positivity and self-affirmation. And it's when you're able to not be as hard on yourself, not be as critical, which then allows you to do the 4th part, which is the ability to be compassionate to others. And to me, those 4 parts are really what is most important, if you will, about self-actualization, because it goes from an inward narrative to an outward narrative. And that outward connection is the demonstration of our common humanity. And actually, when you connect with others, you have this outward motivational state that, to me, is the greatest example of being your best self.
Great. Thank you. Let's see. I'm feeling really full here. And I see we just have a few more minutes.
Mm.
I'm wondering, Regina, are there any announcements, anything that we need to convey to people while we have people here?
Sure. Well, we do have our wrap up with a slide highlighting some of Dr. Doty's items, but I don't have any housekeeping items.
Okay. So what I was thinking, Jim, as a way of closing, I thought maybe if you're up for it, maybe just leading people in whatever you want to do, a couple of minutes of sitting practice, or take people through one of the practices from your book, whatever you're feeling so moved to. But we've got 5 minutes to kind of wrap up here. What do you think? What's your?
Sure. So what I'd like to say is that oftentimes many of us sit and we wonder, geez, can I really do anything about all the suffering in the world? And sometimes that degree of suffering, when we look out in the greater world, is overwhelming, or seems to be overwhelming. And what it does is it actually stops us from thinking that we can have an impact. But what we forget oftentimes is, first, that to some degree everyone is suffering, and that oftentimes even small acts can profoundly alleviate the suffering of another. And sometimes it can simply be a smile. It can be opening the door. It can be seeing someone carrying something and offering to carry that burden with them or to help them. And we sometimes forget actually how easy it is, and also how these simple acts can actually have a profound effect on another person. The woman who reached out to me in the magic shop, since I never saw her again after that, had no idea that she fundamentally changed the trajectory of my own life. And I've heard from individuals who told me their own life stories, how one simple act from another person changed their perspective. And each of us has the ability to change another's perspective for the positive by simply being that model that shows them that there's goodness, that there's kindness. Where does that start? And what I'd like to end with is a meditation where we sit and just slowly close our eyes, breathe in, and slowly exhale. And we think about that individual in our life who has been able to see us in our true nature, which is someone, even though they have a shadow, even though they fail, is worthy of unconditional love. And just to sit thinking about that time in your life, or those times in your life where an individual gave you unconditional love and embraced you, and slowly breathe in and breathe out and feel that warmth and what happens to you when you have absolute unconditional love and someone telling you that you're worthy of love, that you deserve love, and that they're giving you the gift of love. Because when you can feel that feeling, when you can know what that feeling is like, when you can sit with that feeling and have that warmth and that sense that you deserve love, and you feel the effect of that love on you, when you sit with that and just breathe slowly in and release the air and feel the warmth of unconditional love. Let's just sit with that, breathing in and slowly exhaling, and thinking of that person who gave us that gift. And just sit with that and how it made you feel and how it changed your life to know that that person is with you, that you can trust that person, you can tell them anything, and regardless, you're loved. And breathe in and breathe out. And just sit for a few minutes thinking about unconditional love, that you're worthy of love. And just breathe in and out and think about the gift of unconditional love. And I'd like you to now open your eyes. And I'd just like to end by saying that you have the ability to give that same gift to another.
Jim, big heartfelt thank you. Kind of computer hug. And thank you everyone, and really looking forward to our time together. I noticed there's at least one person on here who's in the Australia program, but for most of us, I'll see you all next week. And Jim, let's figure out what bar we're going to meet in. I'm really looking forward to that. And everyone, and Regina, thank you for hosting and making this all so easy that Jim and I just get to show up. And thank you all very much. Lots of love.
Lots of love and so much gratitude, Dr. Doty. Thank you so much. And everyone, if you just bear with me one moment before we all exit, I'm actually going to put up a slide that shares some of Dr. Doty's upcoming events, and also the link to his book, Into the Magic Shop. His academic text, The Oxford Handbook of Compassion Science, is coming out in July. And then you can check out what he's doing at the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education, just down the hill from us at Stanford. And he'll be doing a talk with Byron Katie and Werner Earhart at Stanford this fall. So if we don't see him at the bar during Engage San Francisco, you can also see him in these possible venues.
Oh, could I just make one announcement real quick?
Yes.
Of course.
My friend, and I don't know if you know this individual, Jan Arthus Bertrand. He is a French gentleman who did the photography book Earth from Above. He has a new book a film called Human, which is this glorious celebration of humanity throughout the world, utilizing the same amazing photography techniques and filming that he's known for from Earth from Above. I'm hosting him at Stanford, and he's showing the movie, and we're having a discussion on June 29th at the Clark Center Amphitheater. And it's on our website at the Center for Compassion, Altruism, Research and Education. So any of you who would like to attend, it will be a beautiful film showing, a wonderful conversation, and an empowering conversation about our common humanity. So thanks again.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Jim. Okay, bye everyone.
Thank you. Everyone, goodbye.
Are we here still, us?
We are, and so is everyone else.
Hi, everyone. I'm still here. I guess we're still, let's go on. We'll go for another